I'm Logan, and I'm going to be giving you a crash course on stamp collecting. Now, I'm going to go over a couple things here, but to highlight what I'm going to be going over is how you should get started, things you should look for, how to communicate, and where to communicate in stamp collecting. Now, we're going to hit the ground running here with Chapter 1, which is getting started. And I'd like to go through how do you even get started? Where do you begin stamp collecting? And I like to call this part finding your gateway drug. Now, there's a couple ways you can find this gateway drug. Most commonly, it's inheriting a collection, or maybe you just randomly buy one day, or take one off a piece of mail. But what I find whenever I went through and talked on some chat boards was that people found their connection with stamp collecting by going to a convention for it, knowing nothing about it. Now, the first thing that you're going to need when beginning stamp collecting is a catalog. Now, a catalog can be as simple as a book with blank pages or something as complicated as a dedicated stamp book. But whatever you get, just know it doesn't really matter what you put it in as long as it keeps the stamps safe and keeps pressure on them as well. Next is tools. Now, for the most part, tongs are going to be your main tool. You won't really use much else besides them, but there's a couple other ones that you can look at as well. And some of these is glue. Although it's ill-advised to use glue on certain stamps, it can be useful, I've heard, in some cases for getting a stamp that's maybe in bad condition set well in a book. Now, the middle picture here, although is quite ugly, is supposed to be a watermark detector, which can be very useful if you inherited a collection to see if there's some watermarks on those stamps. But lastly, a tool I feel like is optional but everyone should have is a magnifying glass so that you can analyze your stamps a little bit more closely and maybe see some hidden details. Now we're moving on to Chapter 2, which is where can you ask questions? Where might you be able to find some people who maybe are just as new as you or there to answer questions for you? Now, I think the best place when it comes to asking questions is r/stamps, which is on Reddit and is full of people who know nothing about it, people who like to troll the older people on there, and also experienced people who are just waiting for you to ask a question so that they can help you out so you don't make the same mistakes some other people might have made. There's also a plethora of forums out there which you can find just by searching up stamp collecting forums, and they have great catalogs on almost all of them of different stamps, what their valuations are, and some other online resources that you can look through to build your knowledge of stamp collecting. But now that you've learned where to communicate, it's important that you learn how to communicate. So we're going to go over 6 or 7 different language terms that you can use. These are all introductory. There are hundreds of terms that you can use when communicating in stamp collecting, but knowing these ones will definitely make it easier to get your point across, and people will probably be more keen on listening to you if you know these terms. So the first one, although I cannot pronounce it, I will tell you what it is, which is the official term for the study of stamp collecting and postal history. Next, we have perfs, which is small holes punched between stamps to allow for easy separation. That's basically just those wiggly lines on the side of stamps. I'm sure you've seen them before. And is used for identification of stamps, so knowing what perf is and listing the amount of perfs is pretty key for identifying a stamp. Next is cancellation, which is an ink mark placed over the stamp by the Postal Service to prevent reuse. The type and clarity of the cancellation can affect value, and we'll go over value later. A stamp is perfect when it's mint, unused condition with its original gum, and gum being the adhesive. Used is a stamp that has been through the mail and has a clear cancellation. Gum, as I mentioned before, is the adhesive on the back of a stamp, and depending on how intact the gum is, can surprisingly really impact the value. And cover is the entire envelope or package that carried the stamp. Collecting covers a specialized area called postal history. And if you go through and look at some museums, you'll see lots of stamps are displayed with the original package. Now, number 4, we're going to look at some subgenres. Now, you might think when I say subgenres, I mean different communities within stamp collecting, but that's not completely true. Stamp collectors tend to stay pretty well connected with one another, but when it comes to subgenres in the community, it's mainly different collections of stamps. So let's look at the first one here, which is worldwide collection. Now, this is usually where people are suggested to start stamp collecting, where it's you collect one stamp from every country. And this is how they tell you to start, or at least the people that I talked to on the internet said you should begin stamp collecting. Now, second is country specific, where you don't collect stamps from every country, but might instead focus on one, such as the United States or Great Britain. Those are the more common ones. Next we have thematic or topical, which is collecting stamps based on subject instead of focusing on countries. So you might have someone who collects animal stamps, space exploration stamps, sports, or even art and architecture. And the last one, which I think is one of the more popular ones as of now, is errors, freaks, and oddities, EFOs for short, which is collecting stamps that might have printing mistakes, color inversions, missing perforations, or a shifted print. And these ones are higher in value due to their rarity. So lastly, I'd like us to think a little bit. Before we move on to Chapter 5, which is the pro tips, I would like to go over some of the stories that I heard while I was finding these pro tips from talking online. Now, one of the more interesting things I found was not as much of a story, but about a man who is 65 and is on this Reddit board who answered my question, said that he started when he was 8, and it all started at a stamp collecting show where he immediately was engaged with it. I also received a long message saying how Lexi's is a bad term to use, but then proceeded to give me a list of them, such as faults, centering, perforations. There's about 100 words here. So going on these boards, they will have a lot of information for you to learn about. Now, next, I would like to move on to this one, which was, he said that after attending a stamp exhibit, he became addicted to it. And he started with collecting one country at a time as well. And now he has told me that he has immense history knowledge of geography and just general history, which is a common thing that I hear people talking about when they talk about stamp collecting. By researching these stamps, they gain great geography knowledge and great history knowledge. And another thing that I saw mentioned over and over again was value of stamps. Contrary to popular belief, stamps are not inherently valuable. Most of them are worth nothing. Many people said up to 99% of stamps that you might find are worth almost nothing. And even ones that are more rare aren't worth much anyway. If you're collecting stamps, they said, it should be because you enjoy the hobby, not because you're looking for the money, because you won't find it there. And that was something I was very confused by, because the way that I saw it was when people collect stamps, they're looking for a turnover, they're looking for an asset that holds value. But that's just not why they do it, and they think that anyone who gets into it should be into it for what it is, for collecting stamps, for learning about history, and for connecting with people with similar interests. Now, enough of that. Let's move on to Chapter 5, which is what you've probably been waiting for, which is the tips and tricks of stamp collecting. Now, there's a lot of them here, and I'm just going to go over a few. But the main one that they tell you to do is always use tongs. If you don't use tongs, you're going to harm the stamp. They tell me this over and over again, that you should be using tongs. Secondly is the storage environment for your stamps. They said it should be cool, dry, and humidity free to prevent molding and staining and stamps sticking together. And this one I think is very useful for anyone getting into stamp collecting, which is the soaking technique for mail to get the stamps off. And the way they tell you to do this is trim the paper around the stamp, leaving a small margin. Place the stamp face up in a shallow bowl of lukewarm water for 15 to 20 minutes. Carefully lift the stamp with tongs. The paper should easily separate. And then place the stamp face down on a clean paper towel and put a little bit of weight on it. Now, a quick run by on valuation and investment. Although most stamps aren't worth anything, they tell you that whenever you're buying stamps, you don't want to overpay. Do your research, find what it's worth, and pay what it's worth. And on top of that, you should be analyzing the quality of these stamps. You might pay retail value for a stamp, but you bought one that was much subpar the rest of them. And also, they do say condition is king. Condition is king in everything. You could have the most rare stamp on the planet, but if the condition is bad, it might not be bought. And one of the last things they told me, and was told me over and over again, was community engagement. Most people who got into stamp collecting said they got into it because they went out and connected with their community, going to shows, joining a club, and getting to know people who were interested in it and learning more. But I think another important part of this is engaging online as well. There's hundreds of people on here waiting to answer your questions, and if you have any, you should ask. Now, lastly, I'd like to wrap this up just by saying this is a surprisingly inviting community that is not full of money launderers, which I thought it was. It's definitely older people, but somehow they know how to use Reddit, and they tell everyone how to get started and link everything on these forums as well. So if you want to get started, it's all on their forums. I would say that even though they're considered a popular source, the forums is the best place to find any information and any resources at all. Whenever I went through books for stamp collecting, I couldn't find much about anything at all other than how much a stamp might be worth or a stamp that I might want to look out for. But on r/stamps and almost any stamp collecting forum, I found real usable information for learning how to get involved. So take that as you will, and that's it.